live coverage of a hearing focusing on entitlement reform. The Bipartisan Commission on Entitlements and Tax Reform is meeting on Capitol Hill to discuss the issues. Live coverage of this hearing begins at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 7 Pacific on C-SPAN. And tomorrow on our companion network, C-SPAN 2, live coverage of a news conference releasing an opinion poll on Congress and the President. The Terrence Group releases this poll tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Live coverage can be seen on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. Next, a news conference releasing an article about U.S. Cuba negotiations written by former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in the 1970s. Peter Kornbluh from the National Security Archive and James Blight of the Center for Foreign Policy Development authored the article. This program runs just under an hour.
Coming today, my name is Ray Hederman with the New York Review of Books, and I'm here on behalf of Bob Silvers, the editor of the review. And I would just like to introduce Peter Kornbluh, who has done this piece for us on Cuba, and to thank the National Security Archive for all of the help that they've given us in past pieces. They contributed a terrific amount of information to us for a piece that Ted Draper did on Iran-Contra. They also provided information on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now they've done this again on Cuba. And for that, we're grateful. And I think the work that the archive is doing is something that everyone in journalism should be most grateful for. And with that, I'll turn this over to Peter and let him introduce everyone.
Welcome, all of you. Thank you for coming. I know that a number of you had to tear yourself away from the State Department noon briefing to be here today, and I hope that you'll find it more interesting and hopefully more newsworthy than if you had stayed down at Foggy Bottom. I also want to thank the New York Review for publishing this piece, and in fact for doing a pre-release of it that you have in your packets there. A writer and even historian couldn't ask for a better popular outlet with the detail and sophistication and credibility that the review has brought to this story. We worked with the New York Review on stories that we've worked with many of you on before, Iran-Contra. We worked with them on a Cuban Missile Crisis story that Arthur Schlesinger did a couple of years ago. And it was out of our work on the Cuban Missile Crisis that the project on what we call the Kissinger détente with Cuba grew. The archive collaborated with James Blight of Brown University's Watson Institute for International Studies. He was leading the project. We worked with a number of scholars in the field, a small handful including Professor Philip Brenner, who is here today, to unearth the hidden history of U.S. efforts to arrive at a détente and opening actual full normalization of relations with Cuba in the mid-1970s. We also worked with a number of the policymakers, and they are the ones that have made it possible really for us to publish this article and unearth the history in such detail, particularly former Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs William Rogers. He was a pivotal player in the détente initiative at the time, and certainly was a pivotal player in helping to get this history out into the public domain at a very appropriate time. I think you'll all agree. Before I open this up for questions and introduce the other participants of the press conference, let me just give you a short synopsis of this history. In June of 1975, Secretary of State Kissinger told his two deputies, Lawrence Eagleburger and William Rogers, that they should, quote, deal straight with Castro, behave chivalrously, do it like a big guy, not like a shyster. Let him know we are moving in a new direction. We want to synchronize, unquote. This was almost a year into the Kissinger initiative on a détente with Cuba, which started when the Secretary of State sent a note, a handwritten note, with Frank Mankiewicz and Kirby Jones and Saul Landau, who was also here, in June of 1974. Those three journalists at the time had obtained special permission from the Cuban government to interview Castro on tape. And prior to leaving for that interview, Mankiewicz approached Kissinger and asked him if he would like to send along any type of message, and Kissinger did so. What were his motivations? First of all, what did the message say? The message said, roughly, we have things to talk about, and we should do it quietly, using intermediaries and emissaries. And that was the start of an 18-month process of negotiations between the United States and Cuba. What were Kissinger's motivations? There were several, according to him. He wanted to temper Cuba's meddling in Latin America. He felt that there could be an opening with Cuba, not as dramatic as the one with China, but certainly in the same way. And most importantly, the documents show he wanted to get Cuba off the domestic and inter-American agenda, where it was fast becoming a major political headache in the mid-1970s. There were growing voices in Congress calling for an end to the U.S. trade embargo. OAS countries were moving unilaterally to break away from the U.S. policy of isolating Cuba diplomatically and reestablishing ties, and the OAS was going to, over the dead body of the United States, if necessary, lift the multilateral trade embargo against Cuba in 1975. So for these reasons, the initiative went forward. And over the next 17 months, there were at least half a dozen secret meetings. They took place in cafeterias in National Airport and LaGuardia Airport. They took place at the Pierre Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. There was even one meeting in the private home of Kissinger's deputy, Lawrence Eagleburger. And at the same time, our messengers here, our couriers, Frank Mankiewicz, Kirby Jones, and others, brought messages back and forth between Kissinger's office and Castro's office. Pierre Salinger, who's also here today, sat in on a meeting in mid-1975 where Scott Reston, the New York Times columnist, apparently also brought a message from Kissinger for Castro. This was a very closely held initiative. In fact, only 3 people in the entire U.S. government knew the details of it: Henry Kissinger, Lawrence Eagleburger, and William Rogers. Apparently Richard Nixon, under whose flagging administration the initiative actually began, did not know the full details, and Ford was apparently never fully briefed either. It's important to note, as you read about these negotiations, that there were no preconditions attached by Henry Kissinger in these talks. Unlike his predecessors, he did not attach the precondition that Cuba sever all military ties with the Soviet Union before the United States and Cuba could sit down to a dialogue. And unlike his successors, including this administration, he did not demand that Cuba democratize before the United States and Cuba sat down to talk. Now, the talks eventually failed. When you talk to the Cubans about why they failed after 18 months of efforts, the Cubans say they failed because of the 1976 presidential campaign in which Ronald Reagan from the right was challenging Gerald Ford on the issue of détente in general and on the issue of an opening to Cuba in specific. Reagan was not privy to the details of what was really going on, but there certainly was some talk in the paper about a different U.S. approach to Cuba. And the Florida primary, much as it's going to be in 1996, was at stake in 1976. And that's what the Cubans believe was the reason for the talks breaking down. When you talk to the American policymakers, they believe that the talks broke down because Cubans weren't serious about normalizing relations. Cuba sent something on the order of 30,000 troops into Angola in late 1975 in response to escalating U.S. covert intervention through the CIA that Kissinger and Ford had authorized. This became public, and for the Americans it was a signal, along with the Cuban stance on Puerto Rican independence, that the Cubans really weren't serious about these talks. One could say they failed and leave it at that. But in fact, when you look at the history, the talks succeeded in several areas that I think are very much worth noting. One is that the multilateral embargo was lifted. The United States did not oppose it at the OAS. And in fact, thereafter, as you'll see in your press packets, as part of a gesture towards Cuba, the Ford administration lifted third country sanctions on trading with Cuba. That meant that U.S. corporations based in subsidiaries in other countries could trade with Cuba without there being any penalty under the embargo. And that was a major opening of the embargo, if you will, at the time. Cuba, in response, released a number of political prisoners, including American prisoners, and most importantly, particularly for the discussion today over U.S. policy, the Cuban and American negotiators at the time negotiated the early opening, a small opening to be sure, but still an opening of the door for Cuban-American families in this country to visit the island, to visit their relatives. Those were the negotiations did come to fruition. Those led to a broader opening of the door under the Carter administration, and in fact is that door that the Clinton administration has now closed by severely restricting the charter flights out of Miami to Cuba. I want to close with a couple of questions. What are the implications of this history for today? What might the Clinton administration learn from a review of this history? I think the key question, which of course everybody is talking about, is a broader diplomatic dialogue with Castro possible on issues that beyond the issue of the restricted issue of immigration? And this history shows us that indeed a dialogue on a full range of bilateral issues is possible. The circumstances under which these negotiations broke down in the mid-1970s are vastly changed today, and Cuba is in a different position vis-a-vis its economy, vis-a-vis its political position in the world than it was in the mid-1970s. The United States is obviously in a different position too, with the Cold War over. The second issue I think that's relevant for today is the issue of national interest in talks with Cuba. And this history clearly shows that Henry Kissinger, the master of realpolitik, saw that the United States had a national interest in not only talking to Cuba, but actually fully normalizing relations with Cuba. And that national interest, if anything, is more relevant today than it was at the time. Having said that, what I'd like to do is make sure you know who everybody at the table is and open it up for questions, probably more to them than to me. We have Frank Mankiewicz here. He was almost the facilitator and in some ways the instigator of this initiative, set up the first major meeting that took place at LaGuardia between Larry Eagleburger and the Cuban emissaries, and Mr. Mankiewicz attended it also. At that time, he had been a former press secretary to Robert Kennedy, a former Peace Corps official, and was acting in a capacity as a journalist in the mid-1970s and is now a senior official at Hill and Knowlton. Kirby Jones is here also. He also was there at the beginning of this initiative and became a courier himself later on in the initiative. All the way at the end of the table is documentary filmmaker, senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, Saul Landau, who also accompanied Mankiewicz and Jones on this trip and was there when the message was handed to Castro. Pierre Salinger, who I don't think needs any introduction, is here. He can talk about the Kennedy era and the issue of a dialogue with Castro, as well as the meeting that he sat in on with Castro and Scott Reston. Professor Philip Brenner is here. He is part of the team of researchers that has been working on uncovering the secret history for the last couple of years. And with that, we'll open it up to you and to them. You could simply identify yourself with questions, identify who you want to ask the question to. I think even though it would be easier if we just took the questions at the table, all the microphones are up here for C-SPAN, so people answering the questions will unfortunately have to get up and come to the podium and we'll answer the questions. If there are no immediate questions, I'd like to start with Frank, who has a number of important both anecdotes and is really the most unique individual in that he was the only person to meet directly with Kissinger and with Castro about this initiative. Why don't you take the podium and...
We began this actually some months before. Kirby and Saul and I had in mind to make a documentary of a long interview with Castro, which in fact we ultimately did. Put some 13 or 14 hours on tape, or I guess it was film then, Saul, right? Yeah. But it took a long time, as it does now, to get a visa to go to Cuba. Castro had not been on American television in nearly 10 years at that time, and we thought it would be a useful piece of work and maybe even make us a few dollars. As it turned out, it became almost the most expensive home movie ever made, but that's a different story and has to do with television networks. But before we went to Cuba, I went to see the Secretary of State. I had spent some time with him before. I had known him for a few years, 7 or 8 years, I guess, and had even functioned from time to time as an unofficial advisor to him on Latin American matters. Henry Kissinger, I think, had a broad mind and wanted to hear what a lot of people had to say. I'm not sure he ever took any of my advice, but from time to time we would meet fairly openly, and I would tell him what I thought at least people who agreed with me about American policy thought should be done in Latin America, and he would nod. And I had the feeling that at least he knew that, although he rarely, as I say, took our advice. But when it came time to go to Cuba, and mind you, this is in July of 1974, early July, or late June? Late June. But in any event, in the last days of what seemed clearly to be the last days of the Nixon presidency, at least it did to me, and I went to see the secretary to say that I was going to Cuba. I expected to be there a while, and that I expected to spend some time with Fidel Castro. And did he have a message he wanted to send of any kind? And he thought for a while, and he said, yes, I think I do. And my recollection is he sent me away for a couple of days, and then just before we left, I went back, and he gave me a sealed message and asked me to deliver it to Prime Minister Castro. So we went to Cuba. I kept the message for some time because we didn't see Castro for a week or so, and finally we did. And when we did, I told him I had this message, and it was from Kissinger. And so we sat in one of Castro's private studies at the Palacio, and he read it. It was in handwriting, obviously Kissinger's handwriting, or at least some German's handwriting, and he said at the time, he read it and said that it was a very significant document. Told us Kirby and me what he thought, what it contained. He paraphrased it. Obviously, I don't think he read it verbatim, but it was quite clear what Kissinger was saying. He wanted to get a discussion going. He wanted to move toward easier relations, full relations ultimately, but that it would be done step by step through emissaries. And the implication, of course, was that the emissaries would certainly not be out in the open. So we left it at that, and Castro thought and asked us for advice as to whether he should send a message back, and I said, yes, I certainly thought he should. So when we left, he gave me a message to take back to Kissinger, along with a box of his very special Cohiba cigars for the Secretary of State. And he also gave me 2 of those boxes for myself. So I now had the problem of how to get these 3 huge boxes through customs, and I decided it would be folly to try to hide them in my suitcase because I would be smuggling. So I put them under my arm and walked through customs, And sure enough, the customs inspector said, "What are those?" And I said, "Oh, those are cigars." I said, "They're from Fidel Castro. He gave them to me this morning. They're from Henry Kissinger. Would you like to seize them?" I said to him. And he said no. He said he thought that was the best story he had ever heard on bringing Cuban cigars into the country. So we brought them in, and I gave one box to Henry and kept two for myself. And it started a bit of a cigar habit. But we then, Kissinger then agreed, I guess, or decided within the department, although I always had the feeling it was only he and Larry Eagleburger, who at that time I think was a special assistant, not a deputy or an undersecretary, but obviously a man on whom Kissinger relied very highly. And eventually, Eagleburger and I set up an arrangement where the Cubans would nominate someone, and I called a friend in the Cuban embassy at the UN, and he relayed that and then came back and told me who the emissary would be. And he had a code name, but I can't remember what it was. Eagleburger's code name was Henderson, and he and I have a different recollection on that. We both agree that it was Henderson. He claims he doesn't know why it was Henderson. I claim it was because he told me he was born in Henderson, Kentucky. Seems to me an easy fact to verify. He said he doesn't recall that. But in any event, he was Henderson, and I forget, it was Ramon Sanchez Parodi, and his code name was Vieira. So every once in a while I would get a call that Mr. Henderson would like to talk to Mr. Vieira, Mr. Vieira would like to talk to Mr. Henderson, and so I'd call the other one. And either they would speak on the phone or we would go somewhere and meet. On a couple of occasions we went up to LaGuardia Airport, Eagleburger and I, and met once in a very squalid sort of cocktail lounge at the airport and once in the cafeteria with a couple of members of the Cuban delegation from the United Nations. And at the early meeting, it was the Cubans asked for, and then within a very short space of time got, an extension of the travel permission for Cuban diplomats in New York. They extended the miles they could go so that they could come to Washington. And then the exchanges began, which are all documented in your press kit on easier travel between the mainland and Cuba, relatives, exchange, and the rest of it. And it progressed for quite a while. But that's how it began. Henry Kissinger, I think, was quite convinced at the time that there was going to be a new president very soon.
George Guetta of AP. I was in Cuba in the fall of '74 when Pelham Javits went down, and this was after Castro had read the
we were there.
Kissinger memo and so forth, and even by Castro standards, the speech he gave that night, I believe it was September 28th, was one of the most stridently anti-American speeches of his career. And this suggests a lack of interest on Castro's part in better relations with the United States. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts as to whether Cuba entered these talks with a seriousness of purpose about improving relations with the United States.
Well, I think it's pretty much reflected in these documents that they did have such an intention. I certainly thought so. I think Castro has always wanted a better relationship with the United States. I think he wanted it then. I think he wants it now. I think he has always believed that the embargo was essentially an irrational act, and that certainly Cubans are much more pro-American than almost any other citizens of any other country in Latin America. And I think he probably took that into account too. No, I think there was a very much of a desire on the Cuban side to reach step-by-step agreements. I think they were certainly not willing, for a lot of reasons, including pride, to give in on significant elements of an agreement that the United States wanted. I think neither side was free of the sin of pride. But I think at the time of that visit with Senator Javits and Senator Pell that you speak about, we were there then too. We were filming an additional piece of the documentary to accommodate the fact that Nixon was president when we began shooting and that Ford would be president when we went on the air. Dan Rather came down with us because CBS had bought the footage.
Frank, why don't you describe the visit that Castro made to our hotel room about the two senators? Do you recall that?
Well, you remember that Javits had gone, I believe, at least it would be my analysis, that Javits had gone down there in the first place because he was being crowded from the left in his Senate race by Ramsey Clark and wanted to reestablish his liberal credentials such as they were. So he was there, and Senator Pell, who was ranking, I guess, on foreign relations, was there. For what purpose, I wasn't sure, except to bolster Javits in the New York Senate race. But we had a problem because we had persuaded CBS to buy our film and buy us out, in effect, and finally let us break even on this expensive home movie, provided Castro gave no interviews before this program went on the air, which was going to be in October, and that visit was September. And we were very much afraid that one of you correspondents would trap him into an interview, thus destroying us. And I was surprised about 20 minutes before you were all supposed to meet Javits and Pell and Castro, and the three of them were going to have a meeting. And I couldn't even go, I couldn't even bear to go watch because I was afraid of what would happen. And I was in my hotel room at the Riviera, and there's a knock on the door, and there is the Prime Minister. And he came in, he said, "I want to talk to you a moment." And I said, "Well, fine." So let me put on my shirt. And he said, "I want some advice, Monkey Weets," he said, "because I have never been involved in an American Senate race before. And I want to know what to say." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to advise you on what to say on the merits." I said, "But I will tell you that that if you say anything on camera, we will be ruined." And I explained why, and he nodded, and then he left to go over to the meeting. He left his cap in my room, which I always thought would have been one of the great souvenirs of all time, but he came back to get it, and then went to the meeting. And I understand that there at the meeting he was pressed, not by you, but by one of your colleagues, as to why he was not giving an interview, and he said it was because he had given us an exclusive, and turned with his cigar and walked in with Senator Javits and Senator Pell and did not talk to the American media.
I think there's one
But I think his feeling was then that he wanted to persevere and to press this détente that was underway. I strongly believe that. He did give an anti-American speech, but then that was pretty much his standard stump speech.
Carl, do you want to...
I just remember one detail, Frank, that might be significant. He said he didn't want to say anything to offend either of the senators. And he said, "I want it very carefully understood that I don't want to say anything anti-American to them to offend them." And on that basis, he said he asked you why. He said he understood why Javits was there, but couldn't figure out why Senator Pell had come. And
He was the beard, I think.
yeah. But in answer to your question, George, he was very. He made it painstakingly clear he didn't want to say anything offensive to these two senators against the United States. So I think you might separate rhetoric from actual diplomacy.
I think he felt that the tone of the speech you talked about would be understood as routine. That was my thought at the time. Anyway, I didn't think there was anything new about it.
Do you want to add one thing on the...
Yeah, I want you to go to play.
When exactly was it? When?
September of 1974.
About September 28th, 9th, something like that.
Speech was the 28th.
28th.
Speech was the 28th. It was the anniversary of the founding of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution.
George, that was an annual speech on the 28th. Every year he made that speech. But I want to get to the point, your point, George, of why would he make that speech at a time when the second message was being delivered during that visit? Because that is a theme which occurs over and over again, and occurs in these documents of Rogers and Kissinger, unclear why would Cuba go into Angola. Why would they take this position on Puerto Rico when they're in the midst of these negotiations for the U.S.? And if they do that, therefore, they're not serious. It's a total misreading of the situation, then and now. And there's an assumption that Fidel Castro will base what he does solely on what he is receiving or not receiving from the United States. And keep in mind the climate in 1975. In 74. For 14 years, there had not been any negotiations or any substantial contact at all between the United States and Cuba. You had a foreign ministry in Cuba who's never dealt with U.S. State Department in any substantive way. You had a U.S. State Department who had never dealt with Fidel Castro in a substantive way. All of a sudden, out of the blue, comes this Kissinger note, an unsigned, handwritten note carried by two journalists advocating, can't we talk? They didn't know what to make of this. There was great confusion as to what did this mean. Were we a setup? Was our whole interview a screen for this message? What was going on here? They had no basis upon which, no context in which to put this. So when you come to a speech, and here's this only the second message, he's got a domestic constituency to deal with. And his public rhetoric cannot always be taken, then or now, as an indication of what either the private purposes are. And if you look through these documents, the concern about Angola, the fact of the matter is, well prior to 75, Cuba had troops in Angola, advising the MPLA. The U.S., for all those years, did not mention anything about those Cuban troops in Angola. Why should Fidel Castro think that his troops in Angola that have been there for many years, not mentioned by the United States, should all of a sudden become an issue? Puerto Rico, we hadn't mentioned, there had been no outcry on the part of the United States about Cuba's position with regard to Puerto Rico. We assume, it was assumed by our government, that given these secret negotiations, of course, Castro wouldn't do anything in Angola. Castro was sitting there saying, they haven't talked to us about Angola or Puerto Rico in 15 years. We have this nice little thing going with these secret negotiations. The U.S. government is sending covert aid into Angola for months prior. I've had my troops there. They know I have my troops there. They don't say anything. All of a sudden, it becomes an issue. So I think there was a mistake made then in terms of they aren't serious because they wouldn't have gone in Angola without understanding the historical connection at that point between Cuba and Angola. The final point is on these exchange of messages. What was learned there is that both sides could trust the other if it's done out of the glare of the limelight and without posturing. However small the commitments were on either side, both were met absolutely on schedule and absolutely as they said each side would meet them. And I think what happened, there was a trust that you can negotiate with this guy. He isn't going to use the secret diplomacy for internal or external political reasons. He is a man who knows how to deal in diplomatic channels. And there was that body of comfortableness which came up, which then could form the basis, unfortunately didn't last very long, form the basis of an ongoing, ongoing relationship.
I just want to add, I think what both sides learned was that these things could be carried on not through diplomatic channels, but outside of diplomatic channels, with no publicity of any kind. I don't think, except for Saul and Kirby and myself, and I don't know about Henry Kissinger and Larry Eagleburger, but I don't know until a year or so ago if anybody else knew about it at all. And I think that's those negotiations established, I think, for Cuba, and I would hope for the Department of State, that this kind of thing can go on privately, and most important of all, with no publicity. I would like to think that negotiations of that kind and messages of that kind are probably being exchanged now. At least I would hope so.
Frank, since you're talking to journalists, and it occurs to me, how ethical was it for you, acting as a journalist, to go into the secretary and ask for him to provide you with a personal note and to be involved in the issue over that period of time?
I thought highly ethical. Never crossed my mind there would be any conflict. I certainly wasn't going to report on it.
But that's what you were doing. But you became a part of the story.
Only in the last 6 months. Not for 15 years. I figure that's good enough.
Any other questions for Frank Kirby while they're at the podium?
I want to add one piece to Frank's anecdote in terms of when the message was, his reply to the first message. It was standing at his Jeep in the doorway of the Hotel Riviera, and I think Frank said, "Have you got a reply to the message?" And he reached in and pulled it, and I said, "Oh yeah, I do." And here it is. And he said, the first message from Dr. Kissinger was an unsigned handwritten note. This also is an unsigned handwritten note. But it was written by my foreign minister, Raul Roa, so there's no confusion. We just want to keep things on a protocol equal basis, foreign minister to foreign minister.
Chair Salinger.
Just to say a few words, I was not involved in back-channel negotiations, but I got into a very interesting situation of my own in August of 1975. About 6 weeks before that, I had been contacted by an old friend of mine who happened to be the press secretary of the President of Mexico, Mr. Fausto Zapata. And I was told that the President of Mexico was going to make a 3-month tour around the world. He was coming near the end of his term, and he'd like me to join him as part of the delegation and travel around the world. Well, at the time, I was working for a French weekly magazine, news magazine, L'Express. I didn't see any way that I could take 3 months off and travel around the world with Mr. Echeverry, but I said to Fausto, well, give me a list of countries that you're going to. And suddenly he says, Cuba. And having lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, having lived through the Bay of Pigs, and having had no Kennedy staff person ever meet Fidel Castro, I thought, well, this is a great opportunity because I'm sure that President Echeverry will set up a meeting for me with Fidel Castro, and that was something that I was interested in doing. So I met President Echeverry in Trinidad and became part of the delegation to fly to Cuba. There's an interesting little side story. I went to dinner with the president and his delegation team, and they were all wearing these very special Mexican shirts. I was not. And the president said, "My, you have to have one of those shirts." And he actually sent a jet all the way to Mexico City to pick up a shirt for me so that I could be a real part of the delegation. Anyway, he did set up a meeting for me with Fidel Castro on the 21st of August, 1975. I was joined at that meeting by an important American journalist, James Reston, known better as Scotty Reston. And he was also part of Mr. Echeverry's delegation to Cuba. And he must have had some ideas of why he wanted to go to Cuba, too, as you will learn. We spent a considerable amount of time with Mr. Castro, and I'm looking at notes now in an article that I wrote right after I saw Castro, Pierre Salinger in Cuba. There's a picture of Fidel. And I guess that I lead it with one of the most interesting quotes I ever heard from a world leader. Castro said, "The United States has finished to accept me because the CIA has not succeeded in eliminating me." I thought that was kind of interesting. But in the discussions, he talked about a number of things, and it became clear in those discussions, and in fact I reported here, that there were already back-channel talks going on between the United States and Cuba. But at a certain point in our meeting, suddenly Mr. Reston pointed to Mr. Castro and said, "Excuse me, Mr. President, would you mind if I change my hat?" And Castro says, "Well, what kind of a hat would you like to put on?" He said, I'd like to put on a diplomatic hat. I have a message for you from Henry Kissinger. We would like now to go to a higher level and have talks with you on normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba. Castro said, I'm all in favor of that, but I will not go into any talks until you drop the embargo. And Reston said, well, that's exactly what Kissinger told me that you would say. What about if we had some pre-talks, organized some pre-talks? And so they discussed that for about 15, 20 minutes, came to an accord that pre-talks would begin in Madrid between the United States and Cuban ambassadors, working up to the level where top American officials would actually meet directly with Fidel Castro in going forward on these talks. Now, as you've heard, of course, several things happened in the 6 to 8 weeks after that, because I walked out of there rather optimistic that the possibility of us going forward into a more normal relationship with Cuba was going to happen. But of course, the 30,000 troops in Angola and the conference, a very important international conference held in Havana, calling for Puerto Rico independence from the United States. Both of these things had some effect on the American government. At the same time, it was interesting talking to Castro because George, your question about his attitude. And I must say that in talking to him, he was very much in favor of dialogue. And so whatever he said in that speech was not what he was saying privately when he was wanting to negotiate with the United States. He said that the relations between Cuba and the United States should become normal. He said that for a year, the American government had been sending messages to Castro, that he had responded to those messages, and that he was seeing things going in a good way. He agreed in the discussion of, for example, extraditing air pirates, who he also 2 weeks later gave back to an American air company, the Southern Airways, $2 million for a plane that had been turned over. The only thing he said was he refused to negotiate refused to have the final negotiation for the lifting of the embargo. And he said, this is his exact quote, "I will not discuss as long as a knife is pointed at my heart." And that's when he was talking about the embargo. So I walked away. This is the only time that I ever met Fidel Castro, the only time that I learned that these things were going on. But obviously it was a very interesting decision of mine to go to him and see Fidel Castro at that time. Obviously we had long discussions about the Kennedy administration, and particularly about the very important point that I have made, and I'm sure some of you have read in my op-ed piece in the Washington Post, the meeting that John Kennedy had with Jean Daniel, who at that time was the editor of L'Express, the magazine for which I later went to work for. He's now the editor of another magazine called Le Nouvel Observateur. And in their discussions, and there I wanted to tell you that I did make a little mistake in that op-ed page. I said that he had written a note. That was not true. He had told him everything voice to voice, and Daniel had taken the notes. But Castro, that's another interesting thing, because he never forgot that. He says that he had learned from Jean Daniel the desire of Kennedy to start negotiations. And I was desolated, this is his quote, "I was desolated when Kennedy was assassinated. With him, the relations between the United States and Cuba or would certainly have been reestablished much, much earlier." He sent me some words by an intermediary, a French journalist, Jean Daniel. And I was with Jean Daniel when we learned that John Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas.
Well, I want to invite questions at any point, but Dr. Brenner would like to make a few comments as well.
I just want to underscore one of the important things that Peter Kornbluh said in respect to what's going on today. The question that I've been asked by several of your colleagues is, what is the significance of the seeming stalemate in the negotiations between Cuba and the United States today? And while both Ricardo Alarcón and Mr. Johnson from the State Department have described this as modest pessimism, I think that the reality is that we should look at this stalemate in a very optimistic way. For one thing, we learned from these documents that earlier negotiations with Cuba took about a year, and in the first instance, they were frustrated. It's important to recognize, though, that they weren't ultimately frustrated, that the negotiations continued in 1976 at a very low level, but they continued, and they led ultimately in 1977, when President Carter took office, to the opening of interest sections, diplomatic missions. And even through the worst of times of the Reagan administration, and even today, there's been a sense that those interest sections have served United States interests as a way of providing information to the United States, firsthand information. And so there was a success. There was a lowering of tension. We had some small agreements. We had a fishing agreement with Cuba that solved a border problem, essentially, for the two countries. And in that respect, we can look to what U.S. interests are. And we have very discrete interests in this case, and we are moving towards those interests in the case of these negotiations. In 1 week, we have moved a significant distance. That's room for optimism. I don't think that Ricardo Alarcón would have gone home if he didn't have something to talk to Fidel Castro about and come back with a new position. The expectation should be that there will be breakthroughs and that this crisis is likely to be diffused. That's the lessons you can draw from this kind of history.
Paul, do you have any comments?
Just one little addition. I just wanted to add a note to help clarify some of the things that Frank said, because my memory and his are quite similar on it. I had subsequent conversations with both Ramon Sanchez Parodi and another one of the Cuban negotiators, a man named Nestor Garcia. And both of them said the following, that they really didn't ever understand why specifically the United States broke off the talks. Sanchez Parodi said they raised the issue of Puerto Rico, and he said this didn't seem a very likely subject because we had come out for Puerto Rican independence year after year, and that didn't really make a lot of difference whether we stood for Puerto Rican independence or we didn't. It wasn't going to happen. The United States knew it wasn't going to happen. And Nestor then privately, some years later, added, you know, the feeling I got, he says, that Kissinger really didn't think it was appropriate for small countries like Cuba to play roles in world history or to be anywhere near the center of the world stage. And that was the issue. It was never raised to us by the negotiators as such, but it was more of a message that we got through nuance and a variety of other forms of communication, that Cuba had no business being anywhere near the center of the world stage, even if it was in the affairs of Africa. And I think that that's an important thing to understand in terms